Okay, here we are beginning our first chapter of the actual hard surface texturing part of the behind the scenes series. Currently we have the helicopter mesh visible inside of our Maya viewport, and we're going to begin creating UV layouts for all the individual pieces of geometry that you see inside of the scene file. But before I do that, I'm going to first, set up my interactivity to be a little bit more, or I should say a little faster. And once we have, that interactivity sped up a little bit, we're going to begin assessing all the individual pieces of geometry on this mesh. So I'm going to zoom in here and begin tumbling around, inspecting the model, making sure, or I should say evaluating how the pieces come together, what type of shapes I'm going to be dealing with or encountering along the way, and overall how difficult this will be to basically lay UVs out for. So I'm going to pick the mesh here and check out the wireframes just to see exactly how dense everything is. And for the most part, it seems to be fairly light, nothing too complicated or too difficult to work with here. Overall, I think the modeler did a very good job with what he had to create. And I want to go ahead and begin making my own layers for my objects to be textured and UV laid out. So I'm going to make an exterior hull layer here. And basically what I'm going to do is go ahead and begin picking all the objects that correspond to the exterior hull layer. Now, the layering that I create for most of my scene files and generally at work and stuff is usually based around the actual final texture sheet and or material assignment. Typically you want to group objects according to how they're going to be textured. So any painted surfaces will basically be grouped together with other painted surfaces so that when the material is applied to it, it has the same type of, functionality and level of detail and basically, workflow. So for the most part, if unless you're doing like a game model or something that requires ultimate efficiency and being extremely you know frugal with memory and size, uh, you typically want to set up your models to be in a way that everything that corresponds to that type of material appearance is grouped together, and anything that does not necessarily have to be in that particular texture you want to exclude from it. That way you cut down the overhead of how many materials need to be applied to a given object, but also how many have to be managed by a shader artist or look dev artist later on. And that means creating additional masking channels and all kinds of arduous tasks and things that you can avoid by simply grouping things according to their logical order. So for the most part, what I'm doing again is just going through and creating these layers that correspond to actual texture assignments and material assignments for our Charper model. So now that we have most of the exterior hull picked, I've already added it to my exterior hull layer. And what I'm going to do now is just go through and assess the model that we have left and determine if we have to assign anything else to that layer before moving on. I remember there's some doors on this vehicle, so what I'm going to do is basically make those visible again and go ahead and pick their exterior components and add them to that exterior hull layer. And for the most part, once we have all those things assigned to a respective layer, we can begin a process of doing actual UV layouts. But again, this has to be done to all the pieces that you see in front of you. So I'm going to go ahead and start separating out these individual, sections according to their textures and material assignments. Right now I'm picking out all the glass objects that basically, have those type of properties associated with them, and begin assigning those to their respective layer. Now you'll notice I'm going to refer back to that concept art quite a few times, during this process, and a lot more off screen, simply because I want to make sure I'm organizing these according to what the art director wanted as far as his vision of how these textures should look and these materials should look. So as you can see, we have a lot of clean metal in here, so I'm going to go ahead and create a layer just for those objects. And I'm going to go ahead and pick all the clean metal objects and begin to assign them to this newly created layer. And again, this process is repeated as many times as necessary in order to get every single object to its own descriptive layer for purposes of UV layouts, textures, and ultimately material assignments. As you can see, we're coming back to the door here because I forgot some of the windows, or I should say glass, inside these doors. So right now we're looking at the right door, and I'm going to begin assigning that to its own respective layer. And the same thing with the left door is going to be done as well. And again, any objects that you may forget about or possibly did not evaluate properly, you can always come back and add in later on. And even at the point of doing UV layouts, you can add them in as well. But for the most part, you want to organize everything as much as possible beforehand to save yourself trouble later on. So now that we have our glass assigned, I'm going to hide those doors again. Basically, I'm going to save my scene file, and I recommend doing that a lot actually. And I'm going to basically cut ahead here to our interior section and just begin assessing all the pieces in there. Now, we're not going to tackle the UVs in this chapter for the interior quite yet. I'm going to primarily focus on the exterior stuff because once we got an understanding of how to do those types of UV layouts, you can apply those same techniques to this interior surface as well. But what I'm going to do is just go in and just look around here and just evaluate the number of objects, number one, and their complexity, but also just to see what types of materials may also need to be created for this part of our model. So as I'm going through here looking around, it's quite a bit of work to do. So I think I'm going to just take all this and put it in one layer for now and come back to it later on when I better have when I have a better assessment of what I'm working with or will be working with on this chopper model. So again, just looking at some of the concept art to get a rough idea of how things are going to come together. And for the most part, it appears to be pretty straightforward. So what we're going to do is basically group our model together as one polygonal object, and as you can see, we have no UVs to work with. So once we have our model organized in its layers, we're going to assign an actual material to it that has UV grids or UV identification markers so that we can determine exactly what resolution we're going to be working at and how it appears on our model. So I'm just going through and naming my material according to the actual texture that's assigned to it, which is basically a UV grid. And by the name that I have there, 8K, this means our texture is going to be 8K in size, but the actual UV grid itself is only a 1K texture. So I'm sorry, a 512 texture. So I'm duplicating that about 32 times in the U and V directions so that it equates to an 8K texture. So I'm going to assign that to the chopper model just to see what it looks like with our current UVs. And as you can see, they're pretty much non-existent, just a mess of chaos here. So for the most part, what we're going to have to do is try to break this down into its simplest parts, or I should say simplest components. So by zooming in here and looking at the distortion and just inconsistency between texture resolution from one object to the next, it appears to be quite a bit of work, but it really isn't. The first technique I like to do overall is apply an automatic map to my meshes just to get a rough idea of how it's supposed to be laid out and how it's going to come together eventually. So what I'm going to do is go through here and just pick all the individual objects that are going to be basically in that UV layout and just create an automatic map for it. So here we are, just going through and just picking our mesh here. And again, you gotta keep in mind that, this texture itself, being 8K in size, will have a lot of information and detail to show on it. So some things you can get away with that you normally wouldn't do with a smaller texture. So for the most part, laying this out is just to get an idea of how, or I should say, where we can maximize the most space. So once I do my automatic map and look at it inside of the UV texture editor, I can determine basically how much work will be needed for the various objects. And the reason why I grouped it is because if I were to apply the automatic map to just the individual pieces, we won't have a uniform, texture density. So if you look at it right now, as I zoom in here, you notice that every corresponding piece has the same UV texture assigned to it, and each UV square is exactly identical to the one next to it. There's no one object with more texture resolution than another, and that's usually a telltale sign of, either an experience or what's going to basically be a CG looking, arrangement. And for the most part, this automatic map basically has quite a few pieces in it, but it still has some very large ones that we can work with and use to our advantage for basically fleshing out everything else. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and separate the objects again and begin transferring UVs from our duplicate to the original. The reason I made a duplicate again is because I wanted to ensure that we don't affect or change any of the names that the original model and objects have. Now, unless you have a script that can automate that process and keep track of names and stuff, it's something that I'd rather avoid and not deal with, because I don't have a script like that. So again, I made a duplicate that I can basically do whatever I want to, and once I have a final, UV layout and or arrangement set up, I can begin transferring the UVs from one object to another. And as you can see, I have the transfer transfer attributes option window open, and I'm basically going to begin transferring UVs from one topper to the other and testing out the various options until basically I find one that works right for the actual arrangement that we have. So I'm going to basically go here and just isolate this view and make sure I have it set up the way I want. As we go here, let's see, focus on this tail section, and as we look at it, it's again not that many pieces to really worry about. Just a matter of reconstructing what the automatic map broke apart back into a logical, continuous whole or piece. So I'm just going to go on here and basically pick all the edges that correspond to the given side of one of these main large pieces. And if you notice, I tend to draw these master selection boxes around groups of edges and then deselect from all them other areas the parts that I don't want to have highlighted. So when I apply, the move and sort operation inside the UV texture editor, I'm only moving the parts I want to move and nothing else. And this is a way to, save time instead of trying to go through and pick every individual edge. It's such a hassle. It's just easier to pick, the entire, UV shell itself or edges inside of it and deselect the stuff you don't want, and simply, apply a move and sew operation, and you'll notice that the object, basically stitches up pretty well. I mean, it has some minor distortions that we can fix later on, But for the most part, this approach is a lot faster than trying to go through and pick edges and stuff manually. Um, so I'm just going through and just deselecting miscellaneous shells that I don't want to include in my current selection, and just go through and add them in. And this process is repeated, until we have large, sections or large objects in our UV layout that correspond to the actual geometry in the scene file. So once the UV shells are to a decent level, size, and shape, you can go in and begin arranging them in a really efficient layout. But before we even get to that, I'm going to basically continue here creating a more uniform UV shell and assign these stray pieces to their corresponding sections. But also we can relax some of these UVs out by performing some unfold operations on them, which all that really does is basically relax the density of the actual UV points inside the UV editor, so that the texture itself doesn't get too scrunched up or stretched or distorted. And again, you have multiple options inside of here that you can manipulate and play with to get the shape that you want ultimately out of it. Now, as you can see, I'm pretty much playing with the default, or using the default settings here and applying them to my model, and it's doing a fairly good job of just laying it out as is. Now, there have been times and situations where it doesn't work and it's not perfectly symmetrical, and it does require some manual manipulation. But for the most part, if you work with what is provided with you in these particular options, you can use them multiple times with multiple different settings in order to get those things to lay out the way you want. And again, in the worst case, you end up moving a few points here and there, but overall the rough layout itself is pretty much taken care of with those particular operations. So what I'm going to do right now is split this particular shell in half right down the middle, and basically attach it to its neighboring UV shell here, so that we have one continuous piece to work with. I'm just going to go in here and make sure I pick those edges correctly and deselect any miscellaneous pieces that I don't want to be in that selection, so that when I perform this move and sew operation, it goes the way it's supposed to. Now I noticed I had a few pieces that were not supposed to be there, so I want to go in there and remove those from my selection. And again, I'm going to just go and cut basically the UV edges down the middle here, move my shell away from this other neighbor, and then perform the move and sew operation a second time. And this time it should work pretty well, because it's split up in half, and we didn't have any extra pieces that we didn't want highlighted in there. So as you can see, it's pretty much keeping the same ratio that we want it to do and what we want it to keep with its neighbors. So there's no one texture that's going to be higher res than another, or vice versa. And if you notice, I have a seam going down the middle, but that's strategically placed because, again, the parts that we will see on this chopper will primarily be the left side and possibly the left top portions of the vehicle, but for the most part everything else will be hidden from sight or not very visible inside the actual movie file itself. So again, you can use that to your advantage to basically hide seams strategically in places where they don't show up on film. And again, that's usually an art in and of itself, but you have to work closely with whatever animatics or references that you have to do. So here we are back in our UV texture editor, just making sure we have this piece laid out the way it's supposed to. But also I'm going to save my scene again, just to make sure I don't lose anything as I proceed along. It's just a good habit to have in general. But here we go, just moving my UV shell around so that it occupies a space. Well, it occupies a space in the UV layout so that it doesn't basically interfere with other operations going on eventually on the same texture sheet. So I'm just going through and I'm going to basically, try to manipulate this seemingly chaotic form into something a little bit more manageable and user friendly. And I'm just trying a variety of combinations where I add the miscellaneous pieces that we have, or stray stragglers I should say, in our UV editor window here, and just randomly assign them to where they're supposed to be, and then begin performing different operations to relax the UVs and lay them out so they basically are more uniform and more symmetrical. But this guy is going to require a lot more work, so what I'm going to do is finish assigning, and attaching those miscellaneous small, UV shells to the larger one that we have here. And I'm going to try to go in here and see if I can clean up some of those edges. And for the most part, that worked. But again, it looks really rough on the fringes there, so what I'm going to do is just go ahead and go in there and pick all the corresponding faces to that distorted section on our tail there, and basically separate them out from the main UV shell so that we can apply a different UV layout to it. So as you can see, I'm here in the Maya viewport, beginning the process of picking out the faces. I'm just going to go here and unfold this one last time to see what it looks like. And it's just a mess, so I'm going to undo that. And again, it's worth it to try to see what you can push with what you have. But for the most part, if you feel that something isn't working, don't be afraid to go in and try a different approach where, it may not have been, straightforward in the beginning, but by looking at it after the fact and seeing that, okay, this shape corresponds more to a plane, or a cylinder or a sphere, you can later go on and apply it to that specific area of your model. And what I'm doing right now is basically highlighting the faces that correspond to this troubling piece that I have in my UV editor, and I'm going to go ahead and just separate that out from the rest of the shell once we have all the pieces picked. So right now I'm just going ahead and selecting the faces, and if you notice here, where we have our polygons, basically it appeared to be the same areas of trouble that we notice on the fringes of our UV shell. So it's a happy accident that these all line up that way. So I'm going to basically deselect them for now and just focus on that back piece to basically apply my plane and projection to. And what I noticed here is that I deselected a few faces by accident, but it's not too difficult, just a matter of going back in there and picking them again. And once we have them picked, we're going to begin our new projection, our UV projection, which is basically a planar projection for these textures. I'm just going to go in here and make sure I pick all the faces again. And okay. And again, doing UV layouts you have some times where objects are extremely difficult because you have forms that curve and bend or intersect with other objects, and it becomes really tedious to figure out how they basically work together with whatever tools you may have. Now you also can use third-party tools that do a much better job than what we have in front of us inside of the Maya user interface. But for the most part, what Maya does provide work in most all cases. It just requires, multiple tries to get it working, or multiple combinations of techniques to get it working. But overall, you can get it done in just this one software package. And as you can see, I've separated it out. And for the most part, I'm just going to apply an unfold operation to it to just see if we can get it to look the way it's supposed to. And basically, as you can see, it just has some minor distortions, but by repeatedly applying the unfold UV options, we basically took this random chaotic shape and tamed it and brought it back into line with what we want for our UVs here. But overall, the UV density is a bit much, but we haven't scaled it down yet, which we'll do pretty soon. But first, see if I can get some of the symmetry back on the actual shell here. So here we are, just applying it again, and that didn't work. So I think for now we'll just leave it as is and simply move it around and see if we can scale it a bit to make it work. Okay, just trying to get my central axis here lined up. To see if I can get one more shot at it. And for the most part, I think we may be able to get something going here. Okay, just applying that, and it appears to basically be working except for that one stray piece there. So let's see if we can do them together. And there we go. Let's take a look at our rear portion here. It seems to be laid out and everything is in order. Just a matter of fixing the resolution again, which is just a matter of scaling it down. Okay. See where these stragglers belong and just move them to where they have to be. And just now take your UV shell, bring it down to its corresponding section, and begin scaling it. Now, I encounter this particular error a lot in Maya, especially with my graphics card, and the way I work around it is by simply saving my scene and reopening it again. But for the most part, if you do encounter the error, it should be easy to fix if you have, access to, documentation that, expresses that. But for the most part, if you're in the middle of something in a hurry, just opening your Maya scene file again should do the trick of bringing back those manipulators. But anyway, here we are with our completed UV layouts for at least that portion of the chopper. As you can see, I went ahead and did quite a bit more of them. If you remember the original automatic mapping versus what we see right now, I repeated that process that we did to that tail piece to the entire chopper. So now that I have all the models in our scene file laid out and arranged according to what was stitched together on them by doing the UV move and sew operations, it's now a matter of going in and basically laying them out inside the 0 to 1 UV space so that they're as efficient and taking up as much space as possible, because you want as much texture, information, and detail to show up on the model as possible. So what I like to do again is just go in there and make sure that when I lay these UVs out so that the arrangement is as efficient as possible, that I cover all the bases and have all the objects that are going to be there assigned and set up the way they're supposed to be. So as you can see, we have some objects that can be grouped together in our UV space here. So what I'm going to do is basically go in and pick them and begin moving them around so that they're, for for the most part, set up next to each other so that when I start painting textures, they'll receive the same exact textures at the same exact time, basically, and won't be interfering with anything else. So again, I'm just going to go ahead and begin moving these pieces next to each other, and I will repeat this process with all the other pieces as well, so that you have large, objects sitting next to large objects, and these smaller miscellaneous pieces basically grouped next to each other. So just going to go through and make sure I do that, and just move these around a bit so that they coincide with each other. And here we go. We have the beginnings of a UV layout, or a working UV layout. I'm just going to move these miscellaneous pieces out of the way so that we can bring in some larger sections. And here we go, as we zoom in a little bit more. Now, what I'm going to eventually do is just cut to the actual final UV layout to give you an idea of where we're starting from and where we're going to end up at. I could spend many hours just going over this process and showing you how much I actually recorded behind the scenes on this, but just by cutting to it and seeing it, I think you get an overall idea of what I did, because I'm not really changing any of these shapes physically. All I'm doing is arranging them to take up as much UV space as possible, because we want to maximize how much of the texture information we have created gets applied to the actual models themselves. So by going in here and making sure that we have, them arranged in an efficient layout, we can pretty much guarantee that when our textures are placed on them, they will not only receive the same amount of detail or texture density, but they also will be easier to manipulate and easier to assess if there's problems later on. So you'll know that this shape looks basically like the object that it came from in the Maya viewport. So by looking at it inside the actual flat texture, it's easy to just go down in there and fix it, as opposed to checking back on the model, opening it up to see if this piece goes with this piece, and vice versa. So by arranging them, according to their sizes and their orientation, you can pretty much get away with a lot of different things, at the same time cover yourself and making sure that the texture itself is done to the best quality possible. So again, what I'm doing is just manipulating the UVs here and bringing them and moving them around so that they take up as much texture space as possible. So as you can see, I'm just going through and I'm simply moving my objects so that they basically occupy the 0 to 1 texture space. So as we go through this, basically just watch and study along, and see how these things pretty much work together like a jigsaw of sorts. And again, it's an art form as much as it is a technical discipline itself. So it takes a lot of observation, and a little planning to basically get it to be the way you want it to be overall. So now that we have our pieces pretty much grouped according to where they exist on the model for the most part, I'm just going to go in here and begin again arranging them in an actual layout that makes sense, that's ordered and easy to navigate and understand, so that if someone were to pick up my textures and try to continue from where I left off, they can at least identify some of these shapes and where they come from, and by making sure that they occupy the space as efficiently as possible, we can guarantee textures look as good as they possibly can. And as you can see, here we are with our final UV layout. For the most part, we just apply some basic UV projections, typically automatic map with some other combinations of planar maps, and a few cylindrical maps I used also behind the scenes. And for the most part, you know, our chopper and its exterior hull, at least at this point, are laid out and ready to be textured. So I hope you've enjoyed what we've done so far and are able to basically apply this to your own models. Don't be afraid to experiment and try different approaches and different techniques. Again, I think that that's invaluable, and you should explore, the possibilities that you have for creating, these UV layouts. So, as a final act here, we're going to basically make a UV snapshot of our final UV layout for purposes of using it in texture creation, which is going to be happening in the next few chapters. So again, I hope you enjoyed it, and stick around for the next chapter so that you can see exactly how these UV layouts are going to be used to create some really nice, cool looking textures.